The signal came in wrong. Not wrong in the way a corrupted packet is wrong, with its garbled headers and checksum fails that any second-year analyst could flag and discard before the first coffee of the shift. This was wrong in a deeper sense. Wrong the way a human voice sounds wrong when you hear it played backward. Recognizable as language, but inverted into something that makes the hair on your arms stand up for reasons you cannot name and would be embarrassed. Try. Specialist second class Carl Lohman heard it at 031 station time, sitting alone in the comms nest of Outpost Varda, with a mug of cold coffee and 3 unanswered messages from his mother back on Earth, and he knew immediately, with the kind of immediacy that bypasses analysis and lands directly in the body, that whatever had sent it was not from the catalogued list of friendly or neutral species, was not from the catalogued list of anything. He ran it through the standard filters anyway. Fringe harmonics, xenolinguistic probability matrix, the Dreyfus-Patel scale for non-biological transmission. Every metric came back clean. The signal, according to the instruments, was background noise. Pulsar bleed from the relay station 2 sectors over, maybe. The kind of thing you flagged in the maintenance log and forgot by breakfast. Lohman listened to it again. No, it wasn't. There was a pattern in it, the way there's a pattern in static if you stare long enough, and your brain starts pulling shapes from chaos. Except this wasn't his brain misfiring. He knew the difference between pareidolia and data. He'd been working comms for 6 years across 3 outposts and 2 deep survey ships, and the skill you developed in that time, if you were any good at the job, was a calibration of your own uncertainty. Knowing when you were reaching and when you were finding. This was finding. This was deliberate, layered, constructed with a precision that made the multi-channel array ring in ways it wasn't supposed to ring. Frequency in frequencies that fell between the standard bands, the way something could fall between the cracks of a floor that looked solid. He pulled up the spectrographic readout. He sat very still for a long time, his finger hovering over the comm toggle that would wake up Station Commander Oscar Lang in officer quarters. And he thought about what he would say. He didn't press it. He'd done that twice before, once for the Corridor 6 pressure anomaly that turned out to be a warped atmospheric seal, once for the Doppler spike that turned out to be Sergeant Reeves testing unauthorized frequency modifications on his personal kit. Both times, Lang had listened with the same careful attention, reviewed the evidence with the same professional thoroughness, and arrived at the same conclusion: explainable, non-threatening, resolved. And both times, Lang had looked at him with that particular brand of patience reserved for promising subordinates who haven't yet learned that the ability to sound the alarm is only as valuable as the judgment that decides when to use it. You're good. Don't ruin it by crying wolf. So he sat and he listened. And he copied everything to his private analysis partition, all of it. Every recorded second of the transmission. The raw spectrographic data, the filter results, and why they were wrong. The specific harmonic signatures that the pulsar bleed model couldn't account for, if you looked at the numbers carefully enough. He cataloged it the way his father had taught him to catalog doubt. Thoroughly, quietly, without expectation. Then he waited for morning. Morning brought 11 other people into the station's working day. He played the recording for 4 of them. Chief Warrant Officer Indira Vasquez ran it through her own array and shrugged. Static bleed from the relay, she said. We get it every few weeks when the orbital period wobbles. Technician Graves said, probably solar harmonics off the local star's corona fluctuation. Dr. Beck, the station physician, who was not a signals specialist but was a careful scientist, listened all the way through with her head tilted and said, I don't hear anything wrong, but I also don't know what I'm supposed to be hearing. Lohman thought the most honest answer anyone had given him. He thanked them and went back to his station and pulled up everything the Colonial Authority had on the region of space the signal had originated. Sector 9 declination, also called the Quiet Shelf by the survey teams who'd mapped it in sweeping passes over the past 4 decades. Quiet, not because nothing was there. Quiet because nothing registered there on any standard instrument suite. No thermal variance, no gravitational lensing, EM scatter. No chemical signatures, no evidence of stellar formation or remnants. The instruments looked at the Quiet Shelf and said, nothing here, and had been saying it consistently enough that the survey teams had stopped looking. There was an old tradition in exploration, pre-expansion, on maps in the blank spaces the warning "here be monsters." The quiet shelf was the kind of place that warranted the warning. Not because anyone had seen anything, but because the blankness was too complete, too consistent, too much like an absence that was maintained rather than natural. Lohman noted all of this. He filed it alongside the transmission data. He went back to work and said nothing more about it to anyone. 3 weeks later, the first person stopped sleeping. His name was Edward Hull, 34 years old, geological analyst, 6 months from the end of his rotation and passage back to Earth, and a daughter who sent him drawings of horses every Sunday without fail. No matter the transmission delay, no matter that by the time they arrived, they were 3 to 5 days old, Hull kept the drawings tacked above his bunk in chronological order. A growing gallery of horses in various stages of artistic development, the early ones lopsided and improbably colored, the later ones showing real care, real attention to proportion, real understanding of how a living thing holds its weight. Hull had shown Lohman the collection once, unprompted, in the slightly embarrassed way of someone who knows their affection is evident and has decided to be all right with that. He stopped sleeping on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, he'd stopped eating in any meaningful sense. He collected food from the dispensary and moved it around his tray and returned most of it untouched. By Thursday, he was sitting in the common room at all hours, very still, his hands flat on the table in front of him, his eyes open and pointed at something none of the rest of them could see. He answered questions if you asked them directly. He blinked when bright lights moved over him. He completed his shift work with a mechanical accuracy that was, in its way, almost more disturbing than incompetence would have been. But the part of Edward Hull that explained geological strata with genuine enthusiasm, that kept the gallery of horse drawings arranged by date, that laughed at jokes in the specific key of someone who doesn't feel guilty about finding things funny, that part had gone somewhere else, had been relocated, was operating, if it was operating at all, from a very great distance. The station physician called it acute dissociative episode, precipitated by extended isolation stress. Was the clinical term for what happened. Sometimes when people spent too long in close quarters far from home, cut off from the rhythms and textures of a larger world. She put Hull on a sleep aid and a light sedative and told Commander Lang it would very likely resolve itself once the neurochemistry restabilized. Lang passed the assessment up the chain of command and the chain said understood and nothing further came of it. Lohman sat outside Hull's door the first night and listened to the silence inside and thought about the signal. The second person was Tom Smith, the hydroponics technician, 5 days after Hull. The same sudden stillness, the same mechanical competence evacuated of its human content, the same quality of presence without being there. Then technician Graves, then Vasquez, and then Christina Novello, from the survey team, who was the one that made Lohman's chest do something complicated and difficult. Because he'd known Christina for 2 full deployment years, and the specific texture of her, the way her laugh started in her nose before it reached her mouth, the way she handed you a mug without being asked when she could see you were fraying, particular angle of her attention when she was genuinely interested in something versus when she was being professionally polite. All of that went out of her like a light switching off. She still looked at him. There was still something behind her eyes, something that tracked his movements and registered his presence and functioned by every external measure as a person. But it was far back, recessed, watching him from the other side of very thick glass. He went to Commander Lang. He laid it all out. The transmission from 6 weeks ago, his analysis of the spectrographic data, and why the pulsar bleed explanation failed under scrutiny, the correlation between the signal's point of origin in the quiet shelf and the timing of what was happening to the crew, the pattern of onset that moved through the station's residents in a sequence that suggested something systematic rather than something random. He had charts. He had overlays. He had the kind of documentation that took weeks of careful late-night work to assemble, and that he'd been assembling in pieces, while the station went to sleep around him. Something is in the station, he said. When Lang had reviewed everything in the careful, thorough way. That was the commander's greatest professional strength. Not a virus. Not a psychological contagion that spreads through proximity or shared air. Something structured and external, and deliberate. Running on a frequency our standard monitoring wasn't built to detect, interacting with human cognitive architecture in a way that I don't have the physics to fully describe yet, but that I can document and demonstrate. He paused. And it's not destroying them. Whatever's happening to Hull and Smith and Christina, they're not being harmed in any way the medicals can find. They're being archived, filed, indexed into something we haven't identified. Lang listened all the way through, which was more than Lohman had expected, given everything. Then Lang laced his hands together on the desk in the deliberate way he had, when he was about to say something he'd already decided, but wanted to, deliver carefully. You're describing alien mind control specialist. Yes, sir. I think that's the accurate description. Based on a transmission reading that 3 qualified technicians have dismissed as interference bleed. They didn't have the full analysis, sir. The filter data looks clean on the surface, but if you run the harmonic breakdown against the relay maintenance log. And your theory requires that previously undetected alien intelligence has been concealed in a region surveyed 7 times across 40 years, has chosen this specific moment to reveal itself, and has managed to affect 11 of the 12 people on this station while leaving you. The one person who's been monitoring the transmission data and building a case against it, entirely unaffected. Lohman looked at his hands. They were steadier than he'd expected. I think it's testing something, sir. I think it's taking its time, and I think the reason it's left me alone is because I've been difficult to read. I've been afraid and angry and not sleeping well, and thinking about too many things at once. I think that's interference for whatever it's using. He looked up. I think the thing it can't process is the messy part. Lang sent him to Dr. Beck for a mental health evaluation, which was the reasonable response to what he just said and which Lohman had anticipated. He passed the evaluation without incident. The fear he felt was entirely rational and entirely managed, which is different from not feeling it. And because the assessment protocol was looking for disconnection from reality, and he was, if anything, more connected to reality at that moment than he had ever been in his life. He thanked Beck and went back to his station and kept working. What he was working on, in the hours between his official duties and the sleep that came in fragments when it came at all, was a message. He'd been composing it for 3 weeks, refining it, stripping it of everything that could be misread as delusion or theoretical excess, reducing it to the factual core of what he had and why it mattered. He sent it, compressed and encrypted, and flagged Priority 1 to Dr. Lena von Wenck at the Xenolinguistic Institute on Callisto. Von Wenck had written her doctoral thesis on structured anomalous transmissions from unidentified points of origin, and had spent a subsequent decade expanding that work at considerable professional cost. The academic establishment's tolerance for what it considered fringe research being, in practice, fairly limited. But Lohman had attended a conference paper she'd delivered on the subject 3 years ago, had stayed with him, was not the content of the paper itself, but a remark she'd made afterward. Coffee in a hallway that smelled like recycled air and floor cleaner. I believe something is in the quiet shelf, not a remnant or a fossil, something ongoing. Something that knows we're here and is deciding what to do about us. I'm waiting for the evidence to catch up with the intuition. He attached a note to the transmission. I think it found us first. Von Wenck's reply came 31 hours later, which was the round-trip transmission time from Varda to Callisto at Priority 1 compression. It was longer than he'd expected, and organized with the precision of someone who'd been waiting for this message for a long time and had thought carefully about what to say when it arrived. She said, "The technology you're describing is consistent with theoretical models I've been developing 8 years and have not published because I have no evidence base that would survive peer review. It operates through struct resonance at a frequency that interacts specifically with the oscillation signature of biological consciousness, human consciousness in particular, though I believe that's incidental to the mechanism rather than deliberate targeting. It reads, that's the best analogy I have. It reads minds the way a scanner reads text. Non-destructively, completely, and with perfect retention. The minds it reads remain functional, but they're indexed. They become part of a larger structure rather than remaining entirely their own, she said. The ones it leaves alone are not stronger or more resistant. They're noisier, harder to read, because there's too much interference in the signal. Strong, undisciplined emotion degrades the resonance, the way static degrades a transmission. Don't organize your thoughts. Don't make plans in any sequential way. Think in noise, she said. Don't let anyone know you sent this. Don't let them know you know. It can read intent, I don't know how, but clarity is readable. Clarity is what it's designed to process. Don't be clear. He read that last part 4 times. Think in noise. Put his mother's messages on a loop in his earpiece. All 3 of them overlapping simultaneously. Her voice telling him about the garden, and his uncle's birthday, and the kitchen cat, all at once, in a jumbled layering that was completely incomprehensible as language and entirely familiar as sound, as the specific texture of home. He sat in the comms nest, with his mother's voices in his ears, and underneath the noise of it, he tried to think without thinking, to hold intentions without organizing them into plans, to exist in a state of productive chaos that might, if Von Wenck was right, keep the channel between him and whatever was in the quiet shelf too cluttered to read cleanly. It was harder than it sounded. His instinct, trained over years of working with signals, was to organize, to sort, to find the pattern in the static and isolate it and understand it. He had to actively resist the instinct, had to keep pulling himself back toward the mess, toward the grief and the fear and the specific, irrational weight of watching the people around him go somewhere he couldn't follow. For Old's tree expansion, pre-contact with any of the 7 species humanity had catalogued and cautiously engaged with, about a character called Dr. Mabuse. His father had loved them. Pulp cereals from an era when the threat that kept people awake at night was human rather than alien. The criminal mastermind who could see inside your head, who moved through society like a perfectly adapted parasite, who built networks of controlled minds the way other men built organizations. The thing that made the Mabuse character compelling across a century of retellings wasn't the power itself. Mind control was a common enough fantasy, a particular flavor of its vulnerability. Every version of the story found the same answer. The Mabuse figure was brought down not by a stronger mind or a smarter plan, but by someone who refused to play by the rules of the game. Someone who grieved when they weren't supposed to, who acted on instinct instead of calculation, introduced noise into a system that had been designed for perfect, silent control. The chaos variable, the irreducible human residue that no amount of precision could model away. Lohman thought about that a lot, in the looping noise of his mother's voices, in the spaces between shifts when the station was quiet and the 11 archived people went through, their routines with their mechanical accuracy and their recessed eyes. He thought. They took the signal and left the noise, thought the noise was the nothing. They were wrong. He needed to find the physical anchor. Von Wenck's models required one. The resonance technology wasn't purely remote, not at the distances involved. There had to be a relay node somewhere on the station, something that had been placed or grown or assembled here, something that bridged the distance between the quiet shelf and the 11 minds it was currently reading. He started looking. He looked the way Von Wenck had told him to look. Not systematically, not with a documented search pattern that could be read as intent, obliquely, in the way you look, for something at the edge of your vision that disappears when you look directly at it. Full maintenance requests for routine component checks throughout the station's infrastructure, separating them by days, and routing them through different authorization chains so no single thread was visible. He inspected conduit housings and junction arrays and signal routing panels. Wearing gloves he'd made himself from layers of metallic mesh and polymer sheeting. Imperfect shielding, better than nothing, and he kept his thoughts loud. He found it on the 40th day. It was in the primary signal relay housing, 30 centimeters, behind a secondary filter bank that hadn't been opened in 14 months and showed no record of having been accessed from. Outside it was small, about the size of his thumb, slightly asymmetrical, made of a material that looked almost like metal, but had a surface texture that kept shifting when he tried to focus on it. The way an optical illusion shifts when your eyes lock onto the trick. It was warm. Not electrically warm, not the waste heat of an active component. Biologically warm. The temperature of a living thing. When his fingers closed around it, he felt for a moment, just a moment, the duration of a single breath. Like the floor had tilted under him, and every thought he'd ever had was suddenly visible from somewhere far above. Laid out in perfect order, readable, known. It was, in a terrible and unexpected way, almost peaceful. To be fully understood, to have nothing hidden. Then his mother's voices came back in, the garden and the cat and his uncle's birthday all at once. And underneath the voices, his unorganized grief, his specifically textured fear, his thoughts about Hull's horse-drawing daughter and Christina's laugh that started in her nose. All of it loud and tangled and entirely without sequential structure. And the sensation of being read from above blinked out like a light. The object in a shielded container he'd been carrying for 3 weeks, in preparation for exactly this discovery. Sealed it, breathed, and filed a maintenance report noting a calibration irregularity in the secondary filter bank, resolved on inspection. The analysis took 6 days, conducted in pieces, in the maintenance tunnels, in the hours when the station was quietest. What he found was consistent with von Wenck's models in every particular that mattered and inconsistent, in ways that suggested the actual physics was more sophisticated than anything she'd been able to theorize from external observation. The object operated by broadcasting and receiving on a frequency that mapped directly to the oscillation signature of human consciousness. Not any particular human, but the pattern that all human minds shared, the common architecture underneath the individual variation. It didn't transmit data in any conventional sense. It transmitted presence. It transmitted the experience of being known, of being seen with perfect completeness, and the human mind encountering that sensation opened in response. The way a door opens when it recognizes the right key. And what came through that open door was vast and patient and profoundly alien and interested, in the way a scholar is interested in a text, not hungry, not hostile, interested. The thing doing the reading. Lohman had started calling it the architect, in his head, among the noise. Had apparently been in the quiet shelf for a very long time, long enough that its patience was geological in scale, long enough that the human presence in this region of space was recent on its timeline, the way last week is recent on a human one. It had been watching. It had decided, at some point in the preceding months, that the moment had come to begin reading. And it had begun, carefully and completely, and without any apparent awareness that what it was doing might be unwelcome, because it did not seem to have a framework for the concept of unwelcome. It was reading. That was what it did. That was what it was. The people it had read were still there. This was the thing Lohman kept coming back to, kept turning over, kept examining from different angles. Hull and Smith and Vasquez and Christina, they were still present, still themselves, in every physical and neurological measure. Their minds had been indexed, integrated into something larger, become part of the architect's library in a way that did not destroy or diminish the original, only occupied it, made it aware of a larger context, reduced it, in practice, to its most stable and predictable and readable form, which meant the irrational part was still in there, somewhere. The noise, the grief and the humor and the specific texture of a laugh. It had been indexed along with everything else, filed, stored. It just wasn't running anymore. He contacted von Wenck again. He told her what he'd found. There was a long pause, long enough that he'd started to wonder about transmission delay, and then she sent back. They always leave one. In every signal cluster we've correlated, there's always one left outside. To observe, to measure resistance. Because the ones they take all stabilize into the same pattern, predictable, optimized, readable. The ones they leave are the data point they can't integrate. The ones who generate interference. The ones who tell them something they don't already know. What do I do? Sent. Her reply. I don't know. But I think the answer is somewhere in the reason they left you alone in the first place. He sat with that for 3 days. What he did in those 3 days was build something. He worked in the maintenance tunnels, in the hours between shifts, requisitioning components one by one through separate channels, keeping his thoughts loud the whole time. He was building, essentially, an inversion of the device he'd found in the relay housing, using the same resonance principle, the same frequency mapping, but running it in reverse. See, instead of broadcasting presence and receiving the open-door response from a human mind, it would broadcast what a human mind broadcast in its most unreadable state, and receive that frequency back amplified from the relay node, and throw it at the architect's connection to the station like a handful of static thrown at a signal. He called it the reverb, in his head, without ceremony, because he wasn't a dramatic person, and naming things made them real in a way that required a stability of intention he was deliberately avoiding. It was a machine for being noisy, for taking all the specific, irreducible, irrational texture of human feeling, grief, humor, and longing, and the simultaneous experience of contradictory things, and throwing it at something built for clarity. He told no one. He couldn't. They were all archived. He tried not to even plan it, not sequentially, because sequential planning was readable. He held the intention in him the way you hold a breath, present but not organized, and he built around it in pieces. He thought about Hull's daughter's drawings. He thought about them a lot. The early ones, lopsided and improbably colored. The horses, looking more like dogs or clouds than horses. The later ones, with their careful attention to proportion. He thought about the specific pride Hull had felt showing them to him, the slightly embarrassed quality of it, the love that was evident, and that Hull had decided to stop being careful about. He thought about Christina handing him a mug of something hot on a day when he'd been fraying visibly and saying nothing about it, just putting the mug in his hands and going back to her own work, and the specific weight of that kindness. He let himself feel all of it, not managed, not organized. He opened the door on the grief he'd been keeping at a professional distance and let it be the size it actually was, which was considerable. And then he let it sit alongside the fear and the fury and the smaller things. The frustration of not being believed, the loneliness of being the only noise in a room full of archived silence, the exhaustion of 3 weeks of bad sleep and careful pretending. He let it be what it was, loud and contradictory and completely impossible by any system designed for clarity. The night he was ready, decided, not planned, but arrived at the way you arrive at the moment you have to say something you've been afraid to say. He went to Christina's door first. He stood outside it for a while. He wasn't sure what he was doing, or what he intended to say, or even if there was anything to say to whatever version of Christina was currently present behind that door. He stood there anyway, because the impulse had arrived without logic, and he'd decided to stop requiring logic of himself. She opened the door before he knocked. The archived ones did that. Registered spatial presence without looking. Something about Archimeltic's modeling flowing through the connection, making them quietly aware of the geometry of the space around them, in a way that looked uncanny from the outside, and probably just felt like clarity from the inside. She stood in the doorway and looked at him with the recessed quality, the glass wall thing, eyes present in tracking and very far away. He said, "I know you're still in there." She didn't respond. Her expression didn't change. But there was something. A micro-movement of the chin. Almost nothing. Less than nothing. The kind of thing you'd dismiss as muscle tension if you didn't know the face well enough to know what it usually did. He'd seen it 3 weeks ago, brief flickering thing, and he'd held on to it since. "I'm going to make noise," he said. "I need you to listen for it, the messy part. Whatever's still messy, listen for it." She blinked, slow. He turned and walked to the signal relay room. He sat down, cross-legged, on the floor in front of the relay console, which was the strongest node of the architect's connection to the station, the place where the resonance was densest and most active. He set the reverb between his knees. He looked at it for a moment. This unglamorous handmade thing, this assemblage of requisitioned components wired together in a maintenance tunnel. 3 weeks of careful, noisy nights, and then he turned it on. What happened was not dramatic. He'd half expected something cinematic. Some visible ripple of energy, some flash of light or sound that would announce itself as a turning point. What actually happened was quiet. A faint vibration in the floor, below the threshold of hearing, that he felt in his tailbone. a shift in the ambient electrical hum of the relay console. And then, present in the same way pain is present, perceived so much as inhabited. The sensation of the architect. It was immense. Not in the sense of scale, though the scale was real. It was immense in the way that any sufficiently complex intelligence is immense when it turns its full attention on you. He felt himself being read the way he'd felt it when he'd touched the device in the relay housing. Every thought visible, every memory accessible, every pattern of reaction and habit laid out in order. It was, in a terrible way, intimate. The sensation of being fully known by something that had never known anything less than completely. He gave it everything that was not knowledge. His mother's voice, the garden and the cat and the birthday, all three messages simultaneously in his memory, overlapping and inseparable. Stina's laugh in 4 different keys, the nose start, and the full version, and the suppressed version she used in professional settings, and the helpless one that appeared when something surprised her. Hull's enthusiasm for basalt, the exact rhythm of it, the slight embarrassment that ran underneath the enthusiasm, like a current, his own fear, not contained, not managed, just open, the whole size of it, which was the size of 11 people going somewhere he couldn't follow, and not knowing whether there was a way back. He fed it all of that, and the reverb took it and mapped it onto the architect's frequency. The resonance the architect used to read human minds threw it back. You cannot index grief. You cannot optimize the simultaneous experience of loving someone and being afraid for them and being angry about it and being embarrassed by how much it matters. You cannot follow the specific sound of a laugh or the weight of a mug pressed into tired hands. These things exist in human minds the way weather exists, generated by the interaction of too many variables, never fully predictable, never fully the same twice. The architect tried to process it. He felt the attempt the way you feel a mechanical thing encountering the wrong input. Failure yet, but friction. The precision of something built for clarity encountering something that was, by its fundamental nature, the opposite of clear. He pushed harder. He reached for everything he hadn't let himself feel in 6 weeks of careful professional management. The loneliness of being the only noise in a room full of archived silence. The specific loss of each person's. Not in the abstract, but individually, person by person, the exact things about each of them that had gone away. He thought about the drawings of horses in chronological order above an empty bunk. He thought about the mug. He thought about Graves explaining solar harmonics with his hands. He thought about his mother's messages, unanswered, sitting in the queue. He let it burn. The connection broke like a string pulled too tight, not all at once, not cleanly. It unraveled 18 minutes. He found out later. Though time had ceased to move in anything like a linear fashion during those 18 minutes, stretching and compressing in the way it does when something enormous is happening. 18 minutes of running the reverb at full output with every piece of undisciplined human feeling he could bring to the surface, and then a sensation like pressure releasing. Not painful, but vast. The withdrawal of something that had been so consistently present he'd stopped, registering it as separate from his own consciousness, and then silence. Clean silence. The kind that meant something had stopped rather than paused. He sat in it for a moment, breathing. He heard Christina's door open down the corridor. He heard footsteps, unsteady, cautious, like someone relearning the weight of themselves after time spent as a lighter thing. He heard Hull's voice somewhere, a low questioning sound, first step back toward language, used for actual communication rather than functional response. He heard, from further away, someone crying, ugly and unguarded, the kind of crying that happens when you've been holding something very still for a long time and something releases the hold. He sat on the floor with the reverb cooling between his knees and didn't move. Christina found him there. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking stock of him the way she took stock of people before she spoke. Reading the room, reading the person, the particular quality of her attention, that was one of the things that had gone away and was now back, present in her face like a light relit after a long outage. "You look terrible," she said. He laughed. He hadn't intended to. It came out wrong. Too sudden, too large, with something else in it that he wasn't prepared for, and that surprised him with its force. Water behind a wall that had been doing its job for too long. He pressed his hand over his mouth for a moment. Breathed. How much do you remember? He managed. She was quiet. She was taking inventory of something internal, and then she sat down on the floor next to him, which was not what he'd expected, and which for some reason made the breathing easier. Everything, she said, after a while. It's like being inside a library where you're the catalog. Everything you are is there, completely accessible, organized. But you're arranged, not present. You're the index to yourself, not the person. She paused. I could see you. I could see you standing at my door. I knew what you were saying. I just couldn't get there, to where you were. Another pause. It's like being very far away and very loud at the same time. I'm sorry, he said. Don't. She said it without sharpness. What did you do? He looked at the reverb. He tried to think of how to describe it. The deliberate act of refusing to be organized, of weaponizing the specific irrational texture of human feeling, of drowning a signal in the kind of static that no precision instrument could process. He wasn't sure the words existed in any form that would make it sound like a plan rather than a breakdown. I was noisy, he said. She looked at him sideways. It couldn't read me when I was messy, he said. It works on clarity. The more organized your thoughts, the more readable you are. The grief, the specific kinds of it, the particular things I was feeling about particular people, that was the interference. So I gave it all the interference I had. I gave it everything I'd been managing for 6 weeks, and I let it be as loud and unstructured as it actually was. It couldn't process it. She was quiet, looking at the relay console. Its lights returned to their normal idle state, the hum of it, at the frequency it was supposed to be at, instead of the frequency it had been at for weeks. That's the most human thing I've ever heard, she said. Feeling things until the alien lets go. Feeling things until the alien can't figure out what you are. She paused. That's the HFY story they'll tell about this when this gets out. The one where we won because we were too much of a mess to file. Down the corridor, Hull was talking to someone. The quality of his voice was the quality Lohman had been waiting for. The one that meant he had something to explain and was explaining it with more enthusiasm than the situation technically warranted, which was the quality of Hull operating at full capacity, Hull present in himself, rather than recessed into some vast archive. Lohman had to breathe carefully for a moment. The Colonial Authority will want a full debrief, Christina said. I know. They're going to struggle with my solution, was to feel things loudly in a maintenance relay room. I documented everything. There are 6 weeks of analysis and the physical device I pulled from the relay housing, and von Wenck's theoretical models, and I know. She stood up, dusted off her knees with both hands in the particular gesture she had, precise and slightly impatient, the gesture of someone who considered floor-sitting an acceptable choice, but didn't want to make a production of getting back up. She looked down at him. I'll back you up for all of it. And Lohman, you need to sleep. I know, not soon now. You look like you've been inside out for 3 weeks. 2.5, he said. She looked at him in the way. She looked at things she'd decided not to say more about. Then she walked away down the corridor toward Hull's voice, and Lohman listened to the sound of her footsteps. Present, waited, the footsteps of a person who was all the way in themselves again. Until they turned the corner. He sat a while longer. Through the relay room's single exterior porthole, the dark stretched out toward the region the survey teams called the Quiet Shelf. It looked the same. It always looked the same. The instruments reported nothing, as they always had. If the architect was still there, and he was certain of that, something that patient and that vast did not simply cease. It was quiet again, in the way it had been quiet for the past 40 years. Recalibrating, processing the encounter. Working in whatever way it worked, toward an understanding of what had happened. He hoped it was learning something. He hoped it was sitting with the experience. The way the thing it had tried to read had not simply resisted, but had reflected back something that seemed reading apparatus couldn't metabolize. He hoped it was revising its model, building a new framework for whatever humans were, one that accounted for the fact that we are not a signal that can be received and understood and stored away, that we are not a library, that we are not a text. We are the static in your instruments. We are the reading that comes back wrong, because it is supposed to come back wrong, because the wrongness is native to us, is structural. is the part of us that has been burning since before we had language to name it. You came out of the quiet shelf looking for a mind to read, and you found something you don't have a framework for yet. Something that grieves, something that loves with specificity, something that feels the loss of a person's laugh as a real and physical thing and refuses to make peace with. You wanted to read us. You did not account for the part of us that is written in fire. Lohman leaned his head back against the wall of the relay room and closed his eyes. He listened to the sounds of the station coming back to itself. Voices finding their full registers again. Footsteps with weight and purpose. Someone in the common room, putting on music that was tinny and slightly too loud, and exactly the kind of thing that would have driven him crazy 3 weeks ago, and that now landed in his chest like something returned after a long absence. He slept before he decided to sleep, which was the kind of sleep that only comes when the body has finally run out of reasons to stay awake. Was not a quiet sleep or a peaceful one. There was too much in him for that. Too much still unsorted and loud. But it was deep and uninterrupted, and it was his own, completely and exactly his own. Held inside his own mind in the specific way that only a mind that belongs entirely to itself can hold things. Down the corridor, Edward Hull was explaining to someone. Tom Smith, Lohman thought, by the voice, though he was already too far under to be certain. Why a particular sedimentary layer they'd surveyed in the station's geological core sample was, you understood the conditions of its formation, genuinely remarkable. Not just interesting. Remarkable. Giant. The kind of thing that made you think differently about how long the universe had been making things without anyone looking. He slept through all of it. The noise was there when he woke up. It always was. It would be. That was the part the architect, all its patience, for all its precision, for all the vast length of its accumulated knowing. That was the part it hadn't been able to account. The part we didn't know was a weapon until we needed it to be, the irreducible, unarchivable, unmistakably human residue of simply being here.